So recently, a team in the middle of East Antarctica drilled straight down through more than 3.5 kilometers of ice, into a lake that has not seen the sky since before humans were even a rumor. No light, no seasons, no fresh air. Just black water under crushing pressure, sealed away for millions of years. They finally cracked the ceiling, brought up a little bit of that frozen water, melted it, looked at the genetic traces inside, and that is when people started getting nervous. Not because they found a giant monster or some movie creature, but because what they did find did not make sense in any simple way. To understand why this hit so hard, you have to picture Lake Vostok properly. You stand at Vostok Station, the Russian base that sits on top of it, and it is one of the most brutal places on the planet. Flat white to every horizon, wind that sounds like a freight train, air so cold your eyelashes freeze together. This is where they recorded one of the coldest temperatures ever measured on Earth, colder than dry ice. Under your boots there is not rock. There is ice, and then even more ice, stacked up thicker than the Rocky Mountains are tall. Somewhere 4,000 meters down, the pressure and the heat from the planet win this long, slow battle with the cold. The ice at the bottom melts. It has been melting for a very long time. That melt water has nowhere to go, so it gathers in bedrock hollows and long troughs. That is Lake Vostok, a body of fresh water about the size of Lake Ontario, buried under a sheet of ice that might as well be a second continent. For most of the 20th century, nobody knew it was there. People were drilling into the ice to pull up cores and read climate history, like tree rings frozen in glass. You look at the bubbles and the chemistry, and you get a timeline of the atmosphere going back hundreds of thousands of years. It was only in the 1990s, when you combined ground radar, satellite altimetry, and those deep ice cores, that the shape popped out. A long, smooth depression under the ice. A flat spot where the surface of the glacier sagged just slightly. The signatures told glaciologists there is liquid down there, not just a little melt film, a lake, a huge one. The next question was the obvious one: is it alive? Because if there is one thing we have learned in the last 40 years, it is that life will occupy almost any niche that stays wet and stable for long enough. Boiling hot springs, deep-sea vents, rocks kilometers below ground, nuclear reactor pools. The rule book on too extreme for microbes keeps getting rewritten. Vostok was something else entirely. Imagine an environment held at roughly -2 degrees Celsius, kept liquid only by pressure and the heat leaking out of the crust, with 400 atmospheres of pressure sitting on top of it and a lid that has been shut for something like 15 million years. No sunlight, ever. No leaves falling in. No big inflowing rivers dumping nutrients. If anything is down there, it is not surfing on generous energy. It is scraping by on whatever trickle of chemicals come out of the rocks or leak through from the ice above. You cannot just stab into a place like that with a dirty drill and call it science. The Russians had been drilling the Vostok ice core since the 1980s, using a mixture of kerosene and freon in the borehole to keep it from freezing shut. Imagine a column of that stuff 60 tons tall, sitting above the lake roof. As they got closer to the lake surface, there was this growing argument in the polar science world. On one side, people saying, we have to know what is in there. It is the closest thing we have on Earth to the oceans we think might exist on Europa or Enceladus. On the other side, people saying, whatever is down there has been isolated for longer than our entire species has existed. If we contaminate it with drilling fluid or surface microbes, we will never be able to untangle what is native and what is our mess. Before anyone touched liquid water, they squeezed as much information as they could out of the ice right above it. At the base of the ice sheet, some of the lake water actually freezes back onto the underside of the glacier. That accretion ice gets carried upward very slowly as more snow stacks on top. It is like lake water in slow-motion elevator. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, teams from different countries took slabs of that accretion ice, melted them carefully, and went hunting for cells and genetic material. Under microscopes, they started seeing specks that glowed with the dyes used to stain living cells. There were not many, just a handful per milliliter, but they were there. When they broke the ice, filtered the melt, and sequenced the genetic fragments trapped inside, some of those sequences matched known cold-loving microbes from other extreme environments. Some looked like microorganisms that can live on sulfur and iron, the kinds of things you see around deep ocean hydrothermal vents. Even stranger, a few bits looked like they belonged to organisms that normally live in briny waters or even in the guts of small animals. Now, you have to imagine what that feels like for a scientist. On one hand, it is thrilling. It means the lake is not a sterile, dead pool. There is an ecosystem of some kind. On the other hand, it is unsettling, because you do not expect to see deep-sea vent-style chemistry and warm spring signatures in a sealed cold lake in the middle of a continent. It forces you to imagine the bedrock under Vostok not as a flat bowl, but as a landscape, with geothermal hotspots, mineral-rich springs, and sediments where microbes can mine rock for energy. At the same time, you have to face the possibility that some of these sequences are hitchhikers from the drilling fluid, or from the lab, or from tiny leaks in the system. That tension is what kept people arguing. For every paper saying, "Look, this diversity is real, there is a whole food web down there," there was another saying, "Slow down. The samples have been dragged through kilometers of borehole full of kerosene, then handled by humans. We cannot be sure which genetic pieces belong to the lake and which belong to our contamination. The lake went from being an empty stage to being a mirror. Every time you looked into it, you saw as much of your own methods and mistakes as you did of the thing itself." The Russians, for their part, did not stop. They paused drilling for a few years to address the criticism and to design a cleaner way to finish the job. The plan they eventually settled on was clever in its own risky way. Instead of letting kerosene and freon spill into the lake, they would switch to a thermal drill for the last part, melt the final plug of ice slowly, and then stop, just as sensors registered free water. The idea was that the pressurized lake water would then rush up into the borehole, rise some tens of meters, and immediately refreeze against the colder fluid above, sealing itself off with a plug of new ice. That plug would trap a column of lake water that could be sampled later without ever having the drill physically swim around in the open lake. In February of 2012, at a depth of just under 3,800 meters, they hit that moment. The drill suddenly dropped a little, the pressure sensors lit up, and then the system froze. Somewhere down there, after decades of slow progress, the bit had finally kissed the roof of Lake Vostok. Down in the dark, the water must have foamed and surged into the borehole cavity, then lost heat and locked itself into a frozen plug. On the surface, the air temperature was so low that stepping outside without face protection could freeze your skin in minutes. Two completely different worlds, separated by ice and connected by one narrow artificial channel that had been open for maybe a few seconds. The following season, the team went back down that same borehole, now filled with refrozen ice. They cored out sections of the new plug, the ice that formed from lake water as it rushed up and froze, and they shipped those cores back to laboratories. This is the part of the story that pulls people in and makes scientists uneasy at the same time. When some of those cores were melted and filtered and the genetic material inside was sequenced, the results looked like a jumble. Hundreds of different gene fragments, many matching ordinary bacteria you could find in soils, in human skin, in lab air. Those got tagged as contamination. Filter those out and the picture gets smaller but stranger. You are left with sequences from cold-tolerant water microbes, from organisms normally associated with hydrothermal vents, from species that survive in oxygen-poor environments, and a sprinkling of bits that did not match anything in existing databases neatly. One Russian group announced that they had found a bacterium whose genetic code was unlike anything known, and that it might represent a brand new branch of life that had evolved in isolation under the ice. Other scientists pushed back hard. They pointed out that the borehole had decades of chemical and microbial contamination in it. Kerosene-loving microbes from the drilling fluid, skin bacteria from technicians, anything that could survive a thin sheen of antifreeze and cold, had had plenty of time to colonize that vertical shaft. By the time the lake water rushed up and froze, the borehole was more like a dirty glass than a sterile syringe. Some argue that the unknown bacterium was likely just a chopped-up composite of familiar genes or a byproduct of contamination. That is where the title idea comes from. They drilled into Antarctica's hidden lake and could not explain what lived there. Not because there was nothing, but because what they found in the ice did not fit into a clean story. It sits in this space where there is clearly microbial life associated with the lake environment, but no agreement yet on exactly which organisms are truly native, how they make a living, and how complex that hidden ecosystem really is. Meanwhile, other teams were taking a different approach with other lakes. A United States-led group used sterile hot water drilling to open up a much smaller subglacial lake called Lake Willans, nearer the coast. They went in with an obsession for cleanliness, everything sterilized, all water filtered and treated, gear baked and irradiated. When they finally sampled that lake and its sediments, they found thousands of cells per milliliter, a whole thriving microbial community that eats rocks for a living, stripping energy from iron and sulfur and simple carbon compounds in the dark. That result told everyone two important things. First, subglacial lakes are not lifeless. Second, with clean enough methods, you can actually see that life clearly instead of staring at a blur of contamination. Compared to that, Lake Vostok feels like a half-heard conversation. The accretion ice and borehole plug tell you there is a whisper of life. There are organisms down there adapted to permanent darkness, low nutrient levels, steady cold, and enormous pressure. Some probably cling to sediments where geothermal heat warms tiny patches of the lake floor, forming micro hot springs. Others might live right at the ice-water interface, feeding off oxygen and trace nutrients leaking out of the overlying ice. There might even be more complex organisms, simple multicellular life, grazing on bacterial mats or drifting in the water column. But every time you try to pin down a specific example from the sample so far, a little flag pops up saying, "We are not entirely sure this did not fall in from the drill." This is why scientists sound anxious when they talk about Vostok. It is not that they are afraid of a killer pathogen bursting out of the ice and sweeping the world. The odds that something adapted to a sealed, nutrient-poor, bitterly cold, high-pressure lake would suddenly thrive in warm, oxygen-rich human lungs are not high. The fear is more subtle. It is the fear of ruining the very thing you are trying to understand. If you flood that hidden lake with fuel residues or modern surface microbes, you do not just risk changing the ecosystem. You risk erasing the original signal so completely that nobody will ever be able to say with confidence what was there before we touched it. There is also a bigger stakes nervousness. Subglacial lakes like Vostok are natural laboratories for the kinds of environments we expect to find elsewhere in the solar system. When people talk about drilling through the ice on Jupiter's moon Europa or sending a probe into the plumes of Enceladus, they point at Antarctic lakes as practice runs. If we cannot figure out how to access a lake on our own planet without muddying it, what hope do we have of doing clean exploration on another world where every sample will be precious and impossible to replace? Ethics comes into it too. Under the Antarctic Treaty, that whole continent is supposed to be a place for peace and science, not a free-for-all. Subglacial lakes were flagged early on as environments that deserve special care. Some committees went so far as to say, assume they are inhabited until proved otherwise, and act accordingly. The Russian program at Vostok grew up under an older mindset, one where the priority was reaching the lake first, technically and symbolically. Newer projects like the Mercer and Willans lake drills were designed from the start with clean access as the main goal. You can feel the generational shift in how they talk about it. For one side, punching through the ice was the victory. For the other, being able to say, we did not leave fingerprints all over the crime scene is the real win. If you strip away the national pride and the science politics, what you are left with is this image, a totally black lake the size of a small country, under a roof of ice so thick that no sunlight has touched that water since long before our ancestors figured out how to walk upright. At the bottom, a landscape of hills and depressions, maybe a few warm seeps where hot rock heats groundwater. That dark water quietly circulates very slowly, carrying dissolved gases and nutrients. Over millions of years, anything that can make a living in those conditions shows up and stays. Bacteria that eat minerals and exhale weird byproducts. Tiny cells that feed on those bacteria, maybe something larger that eats the grazers. All of it unfolding at a pace that would look glacial even to another glacier. Then, on one day in the early 2000s, a thin metal drill descends from a world of metal and plastic and fossil fuel engines, passes down through a chemical soup in a borehole, touches the ceiling, and for a few seconds the system is not sealed anymore. Lake water surges into that artificial chimney, mixes with fluids and microbes that have no business being there, and then freezes. When the cores from that moment arrive in bright, clean laboratories far away, people melt them in little beakers and ask questions that are almost religious in how big they are. Are we alone? How flexible is life? How many ways are there to be alive? The numbers that come back are messy and full of caveats. There are signs of metabolism that should not work in that place and signs of more familiar contamination. There are sequences we can name and a handful we cannot. There is no tidy headline like new phylum discovered. There is instead a